That's not a partisan statement at all, because politicians from every single party who think that it's appropriate to try and influence the central bank's decisions. At the same time, if we're talking about what's the easiest way to increase borrowing power of consumers in the market, the stress test is like the...
Welcome to The Flow, Real Estate and Money Show, a show focused on helping Canadians understand the different elements of real estate, mortgage, and finance. The goal of our show is to provide Canadians with the tools, information, and knowledge to have more success when it comes to their investing and real estate related decisions going forward. My name is Alex McFadden, and I'm your host. I can't wait to get you into the flow. Well, welcome to the podcast, ladies and gentlemen, and wherever, whenever you are, I think you're going to love this podcast. I really hope you love all the podcasts, but this one, we've got a fantastic guest. You might know his name. He's been well established across Canadian real estate and social media, particularly because of the podcast that he co-runs with another individual named Nick Hill. This is Dan Foch, and he has become well established and known in the social media spaces, specifically as it relates to his takes on real estate in Canada. You might call it cynical, you might call it bearish, you can call it whatever you want. But Dan has a very clear point and feelings on real estate, and he likes to share his perspective. I really enjoyed this conversation with Dan here today, and I enjoy the opportunity to spotlight the way that he takes his approach on real estate and real estate investing. We spoke a little bit about all the rule changes that are coming down the pipe, what the impact could be on different marketplaces, and where things might go from here. If you're loving this episode, or if you're loving any of these episodes, I ask you just a couple of small favors. Number one, hit that like button. Leave us a rating if you're listening on iTunes or Spotify. And if you're on YouTube or anywhere else, go ahead and hit that subscribe. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode. Thanks so much, guys. We'll talk to you soon. All right, Mr. Dan Foch, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast here today, the Flow podcast, all the way from the East Coast in Toronto. How's the Twitter looking today?
I mean, Twitter's never really looking that good, right? It's like usually if you're looking for the worst case scenario, that's where you're going to find it. It's always funny that people on the West Coast call Ontario the East Coast. I like to think we're in the center of Canada. Like there's still a lot east of here. We call everybody on the East Coast from the East Coast. So I don't know what Ontario is, but center of the universe, I heard.
We'll go with that. I think we can all agree on that point right there, center of the universe. And speaking of the whole, Twitter situation, the reason I jumped into that right away is because from my impressions or understanding, a lot of the groundswell that you kind of started building in conversations were originally through Twitter and eventually started migrating over to the Instagram world. Would you say that's accurate?
It's interesting. Like I've always been an Instagram user just because of our age, right? But I started getting more into Twitter because it was an audience that appreciated like the analytical nature of things, I think. So and then I never really like posted that content on Instagram. Like I honestly had two completely different content worlds especially because like Instagram is mostly realtors and people who are bullish, honestly. And then like people used to ridicule me for posting this stuff. And then at a certain point, I was right about the market being in rough shape. And I think a lot of people, including my Instagram audience, wanted to hear that because they needed to know how to act in a market that was unfamiliar to them. And so that's kind of where the gap got bridged. But yeah, I guess I would have said, I mean, like I started this whole world of content that I'm doing now on Twitter.
Well, I mean, like, as you know, like Twitter is very cynical.
Yeah, for sure.
That's one way to put it.
Understatement. Yeah.
And everybody's the smartest person in the world on Twitter too. No faces, no names, no one sees your life or your story. So it's pretty easy to hide on there. And I found that, to your point, it's been tough for a lot of people to make that transition into the social media Instagram space because, well, I think a lot of people struggle to actually get their voice out there and actually physically say what they're typing down. But you've actually made that transition. You made the transition. And I guess my big question for you is out of that point is just genuinely, do you find that the energy or the vibe that you get back from people on Instagram is different, good or bad, or the conversations when compared to what you would see in the Twitterverse?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think they're pretty similar, to be honest with you. They're not, I mean, I don't think I have as many people cheering on than like what most people would call negative. Like I don't really consider bearishness to be negative because I think that it's a necessary step in us improving our our entire country economy, the way that we do things is to kind of hit, kind of burn it to the ground like a phoenix rise from the ashes or whatever. But I find like the one thing that it has done is it's really given me a bit more of a balanced perspective, because I think like the reception is similar, but the voices that get through kind of all like the noise in on like Instagram would be people who challenge my perspective in one direction, and the voices that get through the noise and on Twitter similarly would challenge my perspective in the other direction. The final piece would be like, you add in like a YouTube or a TikTok to that mix, right? Then it gets even more crazy. That's where, I mean, you mentioned Twitter to be like cynical. I would call like TikTok and YouTube to be
They're at another level.
critical. Well, I know it's like not even cynical; it's just purely critical, right? Like,
Yeah.
I actually like that. Like, I like putting myself out to audiences that are gonna tell me what I did wrong, because it allows me to fix it. I think that like we're all a little too sensitive when it comes to that stuff, to be honest. But I noticed that the easier it is to make an anonymous platform or an anonymous account on a platform, the more ruthless the audience is, right?
Yeah. Well, yes, I would agree with that in my experience of YouTube. I mean, there's people that are going to watch this on YouTube. I can't wait to see the comments below there. I've got some fun stuff on a regular basis there. But, I don't want to make this too much about the odd psychology, although I'm genuinely curious now. You obviously built up a big part of your following based on the podcast that a lot of people know. You got the hat on there, the Canadian Real Estate Investor podcast, and you guys do a
Mm-hmm.
great job of keeping people up to date and sharing your personal insights and so forth. And I think that there's a lot of value in that, which leads me to the point that I wanted to bring up. And I know we're getting into this part early, but just genuinely speaking, with like, as you know, since basically 2020, the whole way that information has been consumed by people has completely flipped upside down and inside out. Not only is information coming, we say this all the time, but it's true, information is coming faster, but it's coming from all angles, and every single person has the ability to give their take.
Mm-hmm.
And their take doesn't mean it's a right take or a wrong take. It just is a take. And that's being taken as the gospel. And so when it relates to real estate in Canada, which is basically a blood sport in our country, and I don't know if people do it for fun, but it's out there, it's changing the dynamic of how the end user, the borrower, the buyer, the seller, the maybe not the developer, but the rest, everybody else, the way that they're making decisions is happening at an insane speed. And I think
Mm-hmm.
it's having a pretty significant impact. What has been your experience there? And what are you seeing?
Yeah, I'd say developers even as well are kind of on that short information cycle. Like you would expect that a lot of developers, even like big ones, would have had the foresight, or sorry, especially big ones, would have had the foresight to not get wrapped up in everything that was taking place in Canada in the 2019, 19, 20, 21, especially COVID, like 2021 years, right? But a lot of them were out there just overpaying for land and, optimistically selling properties at insane valuations without thinking about whether or not the buyers would be able to close on those properties. And so I I think you mentioned like the flow of information, the speed of information. I think that the one thing that has done has it's shortened the amount of time that it takes for the market to react to something. So, you know, Q1 of 2022, when the Tiff Macklem fired the original warning shot of 25 basis points in the hiking cycle, prices dropped like almost instantly in Canada. Well, in Toronto and in Vancouver, the markets that were more credit sensitive and arguably a more sophisticated consumer. No offense to people outside of those markets, but just, our markets are very involved real estate markets. You have to be thinking about downside risk, analyzing all of these factors, because you're buying like within 2% of your max borrowing power.
Yeah.
Whereas, in like Saskatoon or Calgary or whatever, most people are not buying the most expensive house that they possibly can and taking on a huge mortgage in order to do that. And so you have to like take a step back and think, how did this happen? So Tiff Macklem fires a warning shot. Instantly, you have all of these realtors, all, content creators, newspapers, media, websites, etc., publishing information about it. Whereas before, you would have been using the newspapers. I misspoke when I said that, but you would have been like waiting listening to it on the radio, maybe TV, newspapers, etc. And it would have taken you that like almost news cycle. Before, a news cycle was like weeks, right? Now it's 24 hours maybe. And you're instantly reacting to all of these changes. Same thing, like Toronto Real Estate Board, Canadian Real Estate Association puts out data on house prices, on listings on a monthly basis, and the market's adapting to those things in a much more real time. So the flow of information has made it so that the market can almost price in all of those rate cuts instantly, and it almost did, right? Like prices dropped in the GTA 20 to 30% within a matter of months. Same thing happened in 2017 when we did the non-resident speculation tax, and in 2016 in Vancouver when they had the foreign buyers tax in BC. So I think it's just really sped up the cyclical nature, which is good. It makes for a really efficient market, but it also is bad because the whiplash and the extremity of that like volatility that takes place in the market is a lot more severe.
Well, you brought up the 2016 and you brought up the 2018 measures that took effect, whether it be foreign buyer bans, whether it be the stress test when it came in, the insurability guidelines even before that. And I mean, obviously, you can look at any graph anywhere and it'll show you real estate values. As soon as that happened, it took a beating. But as you mentioned, it took a while for that to occur and for that to happen. So if we look back at what's happening right now, and I mean, we can touch on this in a minute here, but just to talk about rates going down and why it's not impacting the marketplace. I mean, I think a big part of that right now, and just genuinely speaking and talking to people, because a lot of people that reach out to me follow me through Instagram or follow me through YouTube, or a lot of these different places are my clients, right? And they're on the edge of their seats on a regular basis. Like I said, people are following real estate more than almost anything at this point right now, and it's to, in my opinion, I think in many cases it's actually to the consumer's detriment, because they're pausing almost their lives to a point where, as you and I both know, in most people's lives, these aren't like little micro cycles. Like it's going to take, they're not going to buy and sell a house in a month, right? They're going to buy a house and live in it for like 5, 7, 10 years and then do something, unless they're, investing for a quick return or the developing or something of that nature. So I think there's pros, because people can now see and get the news faster. And there's a huge benefit to being able to be tapped into someone who's knows what's up. But I also think there's cons, because from a standpoint of like what you mentioned, which is, I don't know if you mentioned this per se, but like all the negativity and cynicism. I get clients that are watching and reading these comments and they're like, oh man, like this guy on Twitter and Instagram and whatever, and all these different places are saying like, this is a terrible time, but I like, I kind of need to move. Like, what do I do,
Mm.
Alex? What do I do? Are you seeing that or hearing that or facing that, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a catch-22 though, right? Like the real estate professionals wanted everybody to listen to them when they were saying, "Oh, the market's amazing. There's no risk. You should buy now because prices only go up and all of this stuff." And then for 1 minute they were wrong, right? And and then everybody was listening to them then in 2021 when realtors were saying, buy real estate, prices are only going to go up for infinitely. The government's going to try and prop up the market. There's no way it could crash. And then 2022, now they're saying, oh, don't listen to Dan because, he's negative, or he's been saying the market was going to drop for a long time. And it's tough because you can't really, you have to have both. Like if you're going to say, oh, you should be listening to me while I'm spewing my BS, then you have to, like, clients, consumers, they all have the ability to access this information and formulate their own opinion based on it. That's why I really try and just boil things down to fact and not speculate up or down. Is really just what are the key data points that actually tell us what's happening in the market, for better or worse, rather than, I'm trying to think of an example, but like anything that would kind of be more like FOMO, right? Like I think people just really need like clear indications. Oh, listings are, Toronto Real Estate Board just published listings are up 35% on a year-on-year basis. That means there's 35% more supply. Like that's real, right? Like that's tangible. You can feel that in the market, rather than me saying, oh, there's all these buyers. My open house was really busy. Like, you know what I mean? And so it's like, how do you really get, like, it's pragmatism, right? This like ruthless search for the real truth.
Mm. Yeah, I appreciate that. And so when people say that to you and they talk about you have this negative approach, I mean, let me take that back, because let me re-ask this question, because if we look back and you were to look at your journey doing this for the last 3 or 4 years, right? That's when you've been doing it more heavily speaking. From then till now, just from an outside observer, it seems like your approach has I wouldn't say softened per se, but it's been much more like open as opposed to direct. And what I mean by that is I've noticed that your approach has gone to, and maybe you don't feel this way, but I'm just looking at it from my lens, is it just seems much more like, hey, here's the data, here's the information, this is what it could mean. Decide on what you think from that, right? It appears even more going that way than in the past. But what are your thoughts? Is that something you've tried to do more than ever before, or do you feel like you've always done that?
Um, I I think I've learned to not inject, like, people don't really care what I think, actually. They care about my ability to explain what is what is true, like, and take a data point and make it very accessible
Yep.
for the audience. And so over time, like, and this is one thing I think a lot of people don't realize about content creation is that you're not like, people aren't always going to just give you the exact feedback. You're not building an audience based on what you think that the world wants. Like, we can make an assumption. There's this book by a guy named Eric Ries called The Lean Startup, and like the thesis is basically like, if you're starting up a business, you almost want to ship, like, just ship the some version of your product and let people criticize it, and then take that feedback and adjust, make these constant micro adjustments to get to a good product in the fullness of time. And content's the exact same way. Like, I started with the assumption that people wanted to hear, my take and what my opinion of what things are. But I don't even share that anymore. And it's not because like, I don't think that it has value. I think in some cases it does. But for the most part, people want a distillation, at least for me. And I think that for a lot of things, people will want that, of real estate professionals. They don't want the opinion. What they want actually is to be involved in a conversation. And
Mm.
so you'll often see that I'm always asking my audience their opinion, because actually, like, that's what matters more to me, because the only way the truth is, it doesn't matter if I think the data point is going to push the market up or down. What matters is what the market thinks. And I have a
Mm.
big enough audience now that, to me, what's more important is being able to gather, you'll notice I do a poll on all of my posts, like, or most of them, um, trying to gather the data point where people can say, oh, like, is this a positive or a negative thing? And then anybody who's going to see that post after can read that poll and say, oh, the market seems to think that this is a positive thing. So that's how I'm going to interpret it. I'm not going to listen to what Dan said. I'm going to listen to what the market's saying. And I've just I've built a good funnel to aggregate that market sentiment. And so I think that that's really like where content has kind of led me, was realizing that, like, through hundreds and thousands of iterations, what people want, and then just giving them that and involving them in the conversation. The last piece I'll mention on this, because I teach a lot of people how to create content for the real estate market, is people always think like, oh, I'm speaking to this large audience and I have to tell them something, but you're actually just speaking to one person. Like, people aren't sitting in their room with their phone with all of their friends, like, what, oh, like, let's tune into Alex's video here, right, and watch it.
Are
It's
you
just
kidding?
them. And so, yeah, and so you might as well speak directly to them, like you and I are having a conversation right now, and ask
Yep.
them what they think. Yeah.
No, no, yeah, definitely. Like, who's the ideal person that you're trying to educate or explain or inform or make laugh or whatever the heck it is that you're trying to do, entertain and speak directly to that person. And I think that there's value in that approach, Dan. I mean, obviously there is people, 40,000 plus people feel that way, clearly. From a perspective of the interesting note on that though, is I will say that people perceive things however they want to perceive them. So you can say it whatever they want. Dan said this. That's what the truth is. That's what it is. Or no, that guy's full of shit. I don't believe in anything he has to say. And so on my side of things, I try to preface most of my content by clearly stating these are the facts, is the information. Here's what I think. And then you can make your own educated guess and then why. And that's objective to the situation. But nonetheless, I think that all this kind of leads to the same conversation back to where we were talking about was the speed of which the market changes. So let's get into that right now. One of the things that you and I both know to be true, being pretty tapped into the marketplace, both, producing content and talking to hundreds of people daily, well, weekly, probably not hundreds a day. We're looking at a situation where we've never seen, at least that I can think of. You can tell me if I'm wrong because you're the stats guy here. I don't recall a time where I saw this many changes in such a relatively short period of time. And in particular, in a dynamic market like we have right now, where it's evolving so quickly, whether it be CMHC guidelines, promises from certain governments, specifically in BC, new promises with relation to, first timer programs. We've got OSFI making changes. We also have rate decisions that are going on. Like it's actually insane. Like it's hard to keep up with, to be honest with you
Mhm.
sometimes. Like, how do you like? What are your feelings on how that impact is going to unfold over the next 12 months? Do you think we see just that's it, we're done now, we're going to see this thing unfold and something, whatever you think is going to happen, or do you think we're still, first of all, going to see more changes?
I think I would be surprised if there was a significant introduction of more policy. I think that they're kind of in the point where they have to wait and see. And I mean, a lot of these things are really just them throwing policy out in hopes of, I think, getting some support in the next election. So I don't know like how much meaningful policy we'll see. Um, but I guess that remains to be seen. Um, I don't know. I guess to answer your question succinctly, I don't think we'll see that much more change. There's a couple of things that could happen that I don't think will, but that could. Like, to me, the stress test is probably the big one that um, is would be largely impactful. But it sounds like the fact that they went to stretch out amortizations and increase the top end of CMHC insured mortgages tells me that they probably tried to get Routledge to get rid of the stress test behind the scenes, and he said no, and that was their response, because that's within the scope of policy that they can change, and with the CMHC as the insurer rather than OSFI as the regulator, right? So, but I am surprised that we haven't seen more public pressure on Routledge by the administration when you have, I mean, a litany of politicians who are utterly disrespectful of the central bank's autonomy, to be honest with you, which I hate, and that's why I have no issue saying it in the way that I just did. That's not a partisan statement at all, because it is literally politicians from every single party who think that it's appropriate to try and influence central banks decisions. At the same time, you have, if we're talking about what's the easiest way to increase the borrowing power of consumers in the market, the stress test is like the most impactful policy lever. So I always think that one's interesting to talk about. Not that I think anything will happen. And then I think that I did kind of before this CMHC thing took place. You couldn't have both of them now. You couldn't reduce the stress test and now have this crazy CMHC world.
Fair point. Fair point. And if we look at it from the lens of, I mean, a different perspective here is the way rates are going right now. It wouldn't be shocking to see rates in the fixed rates in the 3.5% range in the next 12 months, and variable rates in the fours, and therefore almost nullifying the stress test as it is. Stress test at that point would be somewhere between 5.5 to even, call it 6%, but on the low end, say 5.5%. And right now the minimum stress test, or MQR, is 5.25, unless they've changed that from, behind our back somehow. So that
Well,
would,
yeah, but like if you just got rid of it completely rather than the 5.25 plus 20 or plus 200 bips, like, which, I mean, if they just completely eliminated B20, because you're in the downside risk or downside risk phase of the the
cycle.
the interest rate curve. Yeah. So I mean, like, it's not like you need to test against. I mean, unless, and maybe this is his fear, Routledge's fear, is that we end up with like a 70s style second wave per se of inflation, where you
Yeah.
have to, like, that was the Volcker era where rates went to 18%. Not that, like, if we saw a second wave of inflation, it's not like we'd be seeing 18% rates, but we could go, you'd have to go back higher than where we were.
Yeah.
So maybe that's his fear. I don't know. I can't get him on a call to discuss it, unfortunately.
Come on, let's go. You got some real pull now, don't you? So, well, I mean, that's a fair point, but no buts. And back to the point about the changes that we've got going on. So the CMHC, the stress on switches, which, as you mentioned, is only for uninsured switches, which is obviously some people, but not insured options or insurable, which is curious. I think, yeah, you make a good point on the stress test and the impact from that perspective. So, but we do have this perfect storm, and something I did want to talk about. So we've got poor Tiff there, poor or not, whatever. Who's trying to balance obvious a lot there on one side, and then you've got essentially the governments are now coming out swinging, saying, okay, well, let's start making some changes to the rules to let these first time buyers in, because we need to get some votes, and we also do need to address the fact that it's really freaking hard to get into the marketplace. So that is a serious concern. But you're throwing fuel on the housing fire. We have to drop rates for a whole litany of reasons that you can get into if you want to here. But it almost feels like this, I don't want to say perfect storm, but like the storm of events where they're just driving up demand, obviously, with the first time homebuyer rules coming into effect at the end of the year. But everybody's calling for rates to come down 75 to 100 basis points over the course of the next few months, which is going to excite the market. Do you anticipate that that will make things more difficult from a decline perspective and may change the trajectory of where rates will go?
Um, yeah, it's a really good question. I think that shelter inflation already plays such a big role in the total inflation, and like if we're saying, is it going to in order for it to change where rates go, it would have like this policy would have to have more pressure than the past 2 years of rates and rental growth has already had on the inflation curve in order for it to impact the trajectory of rates. So I don't see it doing that. So I don't think it will materialize in a reduction in how many rate cuts we'll see as an example, because right now, honestly, it might actually help us get more rate cuts because it would actually push up the shelter inflation. Because like right now, if you strip out shelter inflation, which is mortgage interest and rent inflation, we're actually like in almost deflation, which is scary, right? Like that's not what you want to be. And so there could have been an overshot at the beginning, and there could have been an overshot already now. Um, and so once you get through the base effect, which is basically the 1 year ago today to 1 year change, um, if that shifts up or down, like it could be it can drastically impact what inflation actually looks like just based on the original base number that you're comparing to. So right today we're comparing a low number to a high number on rate hikes, but in a year we'll be comparing a high number to a low number because rents haven't grown or interest rates haven't grown. And so all of that to say that inflation will be probably maybe too far under control a year from now, and that's why you'll actually need rates to be far lower in 6 months to 12 months in order to kind of get to that recovery scenario where they're actually trying to get more money back into the economy.
Mhm.
And I honestly think that government, and this is, I would say this is, again, nonpartisan statement. Every single politician thinks that the way for them to grow the economy is to spend money, and they're not necessarily wrong. Like, but everyone's kind of moving into like more like modern monetary theory principles as an example. But like, in the US, like, it's Harris versus Trump. Trump was not a like the guy, he's not going to do austerity, right? He was a big spending conservative. And so these are more moderate governments, even conservative governments in Canada who are talking about fiscal conservatism. They're still planning to spend a lot of money. So I think that, and both Tiff Macklem and Carolyn Rogers mentioned this a couple of times from the Bank of Canada, that government spending is a big driver of inflation. On the wage side, like the government right now is supporting job gains through hiring, right? The majority of hiring is coming from public sector employment. They're supporting economic growth through immigration, right? On a population growth basis. They're going to continue supporting it in infrastructure projects like the Federal Lands Initiative, et cetera. And so I think that all of those things are net inflationary, and that's going to actually help us kind of, in, if right now we're at risk of the economy running too cool, they're just going to keep spending. There's two ways that, like, there's the fiscal and the monetary policy side. Monetary policy is your Bank of Canada. Fiscal side is the government. How much is the government going to spend to try and resurrect the Canadian economy as it starts to cool down over the next 6 to 12 months? My answer is, irrespective of whether or not we see an election between now and then, they're going to spend a lot of money. Either government is going to spend a lot of money.
Well, it's almost like they have no choice at this point right now. And so the question mark, obviously, that most Canadians really ask at the end of the day is, who are looking at it from a micro scale in their community or their city or their province or wherever the heck they are. And let's not think about this from an investing perspective. Let's just talk about this from a home perspective. Is how does this affect, at the end of the day, how does this affect my ability to put my food on the table and have a vacation, have kids and all that kind of stuff? And that comes down to obviously interest rates and my house value. With not to get into the whole renewal situation coming up, but it's a real fact and it's a real consideration, which obviously is there's no doubt at this point right now is on the government's mind as far as a real, how do we avoid this potential oopsie from happening in a couple of years where people aren't able to to make ends meet. But we're also, as you mentioned, balancing millions of new people in the country that within the next 2 years are going to be 2 years in our country. And that's typically speaking when they start to dig into looking into buying. They start that process. Now, the average, I saw a stat, maybe I don't know if you saw the same one, where it showed that the average new immigrant to our country buys a home at, I believe, at 5 years. Is that the average timeline at which they get like buying real estate, although they can start
Mhm.
there. And we see some people do. So contrary to what most people think, like honestly, I don't think many people like come to our country and buy a house in 6 months. Like there's just not a very common outcome. But in 3, 4, 5 years, which will have started in basically 2021 and on, we're going to be looking at 2024, 2025, 2026. Now, 5 years in the country, people are going to be buying left, right, and center. You mentioned a few other points there about the fact that, well, deflation is already here. We're going to see rates go down. And the question mark is, do we see another quote unquote storm of events in 2 years as it pertains to the real estate industry? Because there's just going to be such an extreme amount of demand, and as everybody knows that looks at almost any chart right now, there's just not been enough development. So where we go from here? What happens there? And how do they address that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a question that we've answered, uh, in in a different way than anybody else. Like most people, so look, it's easy to think about demand in like a, a, a couple of different ways, but the idea of like a sink, right, is like the is an interesting one. So let's say you are filling this sink and it gets full of water, right? You can either add new vessels, right, or it's going to spill over. And so the spilling over piece is that water going, or that demand going from a Toronto or a Vancouver to a Calgary, right, which you can see, or a Halifax, which you can see, that's visible, right? So people can't afford Toronto anymore. Everybody wants to move to Toronto. A lot of the international migration ends up in Toronto, and then it becomes interprovincial migration when people try to live in Toronto, realize that it's unaffordable, and go to a different city. Halifax, Calgary, probably the two biggest recipients. So that's example number one, is adding these, or sorry, is the spilling over into different markets. Number two is adding vessels, right? So you add another sink, and that's more building more houses. But there's another question, or there's another way to think about it, is like, what if demand isn't water? What if this is like, what if demand is sand, as an example? And if demand is sand, then you can actually get a plate tamper, or a brick, and just start packing that sand into the sink tighter and tighter. And that's the piece that I think a lot of people haven't really thought about, which is, what if we just have all of the same amount of people that are coming to Canada without adding more supply get packed into what's already there? And that's what we're actually seeing more than anything else. This is where you're seeing roommates becoming the fastest growing household type in Canada, right? This is where you're seeing DIY density. You drive through a new build subdivision in the GTA or in the Lower Mainland. All the 4-bedroom houses have 4 cars in the driveway because it's 4 adults renting, because they can't afford a 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom unit to themselves anymore. And so young people, workforce housing is very much going into that roommate tenure and co-living arrangements. Multiplexes are a version of this, right? So as you start to see a lot of that um, supply that is currently in the hands of people who will downsize, baby boomers, come on the market, that supply will get cut up into the rooming houses like I just described. Or, I mean, a McMansion is like, you could cut that into 2 decent family sized houses, right? A 3,000 square foot house in the suburban area of one of Canada's big cities for 1.5 million. If you spend 250 or 300K or 500K even renovating that, it's still, $1 million per suite. And the suites are 1,500 square feet, rather, each suite, upstairs is 1,500, downstairs is 1,500, rather than this 500 or 600 square foot units that are being, or even that would be big, 200 or 300 square foot units that are being built by the condominium developer world today. And so that's what I honestly think that's what's going to happen. And like that is a visible trend that has taken place in other cities before us, right? New York, as an example, in the early 1900s, London in the 1800s. Like London had more people in the 1800s than it does today, right? In the 1820s, I think. And because it was easy, like during that period of time, it was easy to migrate there. You didn't have to risk your life crossing the ocean. It was the financial hub center of the world. No, and I'm not making any claims that Toronto is that today, but Toronto is a place that a lot of people in the world want to move to. What happened in London during that time. Well, all of those row houses got cut up into, what do we call them today? Flats, right? Like the origination of a flat came from that.
Well, there's a few. It's an interesting point, and it's a similar conversation to one I've had from a few of my peers in the U.S., specifically in San Diego, where they're doing SDUs all over the place in Canada, secondary dwelling units. I assume that's roughly what you're referring to, or something similar to that. There's a few things that have to happen for that to occur. Obviously, as you know, like from a technical standpoint, the person who has the house has to be willing to either do the work or to sell it off in that capacity, or get rid of it, or whatever they'd like to think. And then B, of course, people would have to be comfortable with purchasing it. So I think there's probably that's something that could happen, and I think it just probably comes down more than anything else to our culture and community actually saying they want to be able to own and buy these things, which is probably a time thing more than anything else, assuming that the country supports it, the government support this sort of thing. As you know, like there's a whole other factor to consider here. Like if you can look at a London or a New York, and I don't know Toronto that well. Like I've been there a few times. I've never lived there, but if you look at a London or New York, it's a little bit different from a lifestyle perspective, right? Like you can walk anywhere or everywhere, and you have sky trains and tunnels and buses and walking distances for everything. If you look at the majority of country or big cities in our country, that's not the case. I mean, look at Vancouver. Like I wouldn't call that like a super walkable city. If you get out to the valley outside of that, it's definitely not walkable. Again, I don't know what Toronto is like. I suppose there's downtown cores that you could do that, but I assume most of that's just going to end up being high rises. So that wouldn't really be the case in a lot of these properties. So I just look at it from a logistical perspective, and we're seeing that already in British Columbia, where the province has said, okay, you have to be able to allow 4 dwellings on every single lot. And well, the cities are fighting back and saying, F that, we're not putting 4 dwellings. We have no way to be able to deal with the roads or the people or even the sewage or the garbage or all these different things associated with that. Our
Yeah.
community plans are thrown out the window. So I think it's a great idea, and I don't disagree. And I think the fact that they're not building any, there's no detached homes going up anywhere, argues to say that there's an opportunity there. But yeah, just the logistics of it make me wonder how and when and how far and who's supporting that.
Yeah. I mean, maybe that's the government spending that we see that I mentioned, but they'll, like, I would agree with you. I think that we're not equipped to have that model succeed here at the moment, right? So how do we get to the next phase? Well, we got to spend a lot of money on infrastructure,
Yeah.
and so that could be piece one. Piece two could be the private sector response to it. So you see, like, I mean, like the most, the most like far-fetched example I would have is like, in 5 or 10 years, FSD on Teslas becomes so good that, like, there's a private sector transit system of Ubers that are driving everybody around all these places, and we can still get by on the car dependent infrastructure that we have with a denser world. And that would make sense comparatively to a London, where taxis, or a New York, where again, taxis are really the thing, even though they have the tube in London. And I mean, that's probably where the biggest area where Toronto is kind of falling behind is on the mass public transit.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. When you get a chance, and I'll put this in the notes as well for anybody watching or listening, look up, it's actually called Accessory Dwelling Unit in San Diego, or if you just search them up, or a couple of other cities. I know that they've had a lot of success there and talked to a few folks. And I think that's similar to what you're referring to here
Mm-hmm.
in relation to being able to create more from what we have right here. All right,
Yeah.
few more questions on
Yeah,
that. And then
actually, on that note, EQ, I think, just came out with a financing program for ADUs, like for garden suites and stuff like that. So
yeah, their new construction program looks pretty cool for people to be able to have the opportunity to, if they have the permits and the space and so forth, to add that secondary unit or coach home. We just need to find a way to do that in a financially beneficial way, because right now building those things is so freaking expensive. It's insane.
mm-hmm.
Coach homes, we see those all over the place here. I don't know if you
Yeah.
see a lot of those. Yeah, so with that being said, I think that the last key point, and hopefully, Dan, we can find some time to connect again in the future, is just kind of looking forward from an investing perspective, which is the point of your show. I mean, if you guys want to listen more to some of the investment talk that Dan has, he's talked about it for ages, and they have a program and so forth where they talk about it. But I am, as someone who's been helping clients purchase real estate as an investment for the better part of 4 or 5 plus years, maybe more than that. I guess at this point, I've been licensed for a long time, but that's where I've focused for a long time. And getting that first or second step, investment strategies obviously change as the market changes, which is not a bad thing. It's adapting to climates and markets and so forth. I'm seeing a lot more calls. I'm getting a lot more calls. I'm seeing emails, and this is just anecdotal. So it's just my feedback, just sharing from 2023, where nobody it's not nobody, like, very short and a small amount of people were reaching out with anything to do with investing. Like, you can look at my social media and see what type of responses I'm getting. I can look at the calls I'm getting, emails. Now the calls are coming back. People are looking at it again. Obviously, most people they got stung by something like, what do you call this? A condo that just didn't make sense probably in the first place, or maybe they purchased, a pre-sale property that was never going to be a good fit, but for whatever reason they got caught up in the hype, and they're asking questions. What do I do? Where do I go? And I think that most people right now are being more cautious, but there also is a level of excitement in the marketplace right now for what to look at. And I know you talk about, some of the multifamily work that you've done and got involved in, but not everybody wants to go down that road. Long-winded way to get into the next point, which is, if somebody is still interested in residential real estate as an opportunity to invest in some capacity, where are you directing them?
I'm typically showing people a couple of different strategies. The big one would be, a lot of people are afraid of speculative markets right now, so they're looking outside of markets that rely on price growth, or investment strategies that rely on price growth as a primary driver. So that would be avoiding your Toronto, Vancouver, etc. So that would be like, cash flow markets, anywhere where there's fundamentals. The next piece would actually be, going into those markets, the Toronto, Vancouver, and doing an add value strategy. So based on multiplexing or ADUs or like laneway homes. And that's where, it's a little bit more of a sophisticated strategy, but the people who can acquire well, renovate well, keep, project manage well, keep costs low, can actually, bring pretty meaningful units to market, but also, see outsized returns. So if you're buying land in Toronto for 1 to 1.5 million, and you can either add multiple units to that house or tear it down and rebuild it in a very cost-effective way, you're making money in today's market for sure.
Interesting. Well, I appreciate that perspective coming from your side there. It's always super valuable to hear where things are going. And at that, I'm going to cap it, because we went through a lot and we went pretty deep there, all the way from social media landscapes to how people respond. I'm genuinely curious, Dan, and I'll send you the YouTube link to see what the YouTube comments on this one look like. I'm sure it'll be a blast to work through. We've got hopefully we get the odd positive one in there. I like those happy smiley faces, you name it. Or you can add a little smiley face at the end of your comment if you're doing this. If you're listening to the podcast, thank you so much for listening. Make sure to go ahead and subscribe and check out Dan's podcast. Everything will be in the show notes. Dan, thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
That was an unreal episode of The Flow. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did on my side right here. If you haven't already done so, make sure to check out all of the incredible resources that we have available. You can find us on Instagram at Flow Mortgage Co. You can find us on our website, getflowmortgage.ca. And of course, don't forget our free first-time homebuyer masterclass that's currently available on our website for anyone who listens to the episodes. And if you loved what you listened here today, the only thing that we ask for is to share this with someone else that you think this could help. And hey, maybe leave us a great review online.